Imagine this, it's a bustling market day in 19th century England. The air is thick with the smell of livestock and unwashed bodies. You hear the shouts of vendors selling everything from pigs to pottery. But then, you see something that stops you in your tracks. A man, grim-faced and determined, leads a woman through the crowd. She isn't walking beside him as an equal, but is led by a rope, a halter tied around her neck, her wrist, or her waist. He mounts the town steps or a public block, not to sell a prize-winning pig, but to auction off his own wife. The bidding starts. A few shillings. A pint of gin. A week's wages. This isn't a scene from a twisted novel, this was a shocking reality for hundreds, possibly thousands, of people in the Victorian era. It's a custom so bizarre, so degrading, it feels like it must be a myth. But it wasn't. And the real reason why a man would publicly sell his wife is far more complex and, in many ways, more horrific than the act itself. Stick around as we uncover the strange and desperate truth behind the English custom of wife selling. When we think of a Victorian market, we envision stalls of fresh produce, livestock pens, and merchants haggling over prices. The wife auction turned this familiar scene into a disturbing theater of human commerce. The ritual was shockingly public. The husband would often place an advertisement in a local newspaper beforehand, announcing the time and place of the sale. On the day, he would lead his wife to the busiest part of town, the market cross, the local pub, or the cattle auction, to ensure there were plenty of witnesses. The halter was a crucial piece of symbolism. By placing a rope around his wife, the husband was quite literally treating her as chattel, a piece of property like the livestock being sold just a few feet away. He would make a speech, sometimes praising his wife's qualities as a housekeeper or worker, other times listing her faults as a warning to potential buyers. Then, the bidding would begin. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers, gossips, and potential buyers, would shout their offers. The final sale was often sealed with a handshake and a trip to the nearest tavern to finalize the exchange over a drink. To them, the public nature of the transaction was what made it legitimate. It wasn't a shameful secret, it was a community event, a formal, albeit illegal, severing of a marital bond. From our modern perspective, wife selling seems like the ultimate act of misogyny and cruelty. And while it was undeniably degrading, it wasn't usually an act of spontaneous brutality. It was a deeply ingrained folk tradition, a customary ritual that had been practiced in rural parts of England since at least the late 17th century. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a calculated, pre-planned event. For the lower classes of Victorian society, the farm labourers, the factory workers, the miners, life was brutal, and the law was a distant, hostile force. The customs and traditions of their own communities held more power and relevance than the edicts passed down by a parliament of wealthy aristocrats. Wife selling was one of these customs. It was seen by many not as a barbaric act, but as a practical solution to an unsolvable problem. To understand why, we have to look at the one thing that was completely out of reach for the average person: divorce. Today, if a marriage breaks down, divorce is a legal, albeit painful, option available to everyone. In Victorian England, this was pure fantasy for over 99% of the population. Getting a legal divorce was a privilege reserved for the incredibly wealthy and powerful. The process was astronomically expensive and deliberately humiliating. First, a man had to sue his wife's lover for criminal conversation, a civil action that basically accused the other man of property damage, the property being his wife's fidelity. This involved a public trial where all the sordid details of the affair were aired out for the nation's entertainment. If he won, he would then need to secure a legal separation from the church courts. Only after completing these two incredibly costly steps could he petition the House of Lords for a full act of Parliament granting him a divorce. The entire process could cost thousands of pounds, the equivalent of a modern-day fortune. For a labourer earning less than £1 a week, it was as unattainable as buying the moon. For women, it was even harder. A wife could only sue for divorce on the grounds of adultery if it was combined with life-threatening cruelty, incest, or bigamy. Faced with this impossible legal barrier, what were unhappy couples supposed to do? If a marriage was filled with violence, infidelity, or just pure misery, they were trapped. Legally, they were bound together for life. This is where wife-selling emerged as a folk remedy a poor man's divorce. By creating a public ritual that mimicked a legal transaction, the community could recognize the marriage as being over. The halter, the auction, and the exchange of money were all symbolic elements designed to create a binding contract in the eyes of the people, even if it had no standing in a real court. The husband was publicly relinquishing his marital duties and rights, and the buyer was publicly accepting them. This ritual provided a clear, decisive end to the marriage, allowing both parties to move on and form new relationships without being accused of bigamy by their neighbors. It was a desperate, DIY solution to a legal system that had utterly failed them. To be crystal clear, wife-selling was completely illegal. It had no basis in English law, and participants could be, and sometimes were, prosecuted. They could be charged with public disorder, conspiracy, or even the archaic crime of selling a corrupt commodity. However, prosecutions were surprisingly rare. Local magistrates and authorities often understood the impossible position of the poor. They knew that a legal divorce was out of reach and that forcing a miserable or violent couple to stay together could lead to even worse outcomes, like assault or murder. As a result, many authorities simply turned a blind eye. As long as the sale was conducted peacefully and everyone involved consented, they were often willing to let the community handle its own affairs. This created a strange paradox where a practice was simultaneously a public crime and a tacitly accepted social custom. It existed in a legal gray area, a testament to the massive gap between the official law of the land and the lived reality of the working class. The image of a woman being dragged to market by a rope is one of utter victimhood. And in some cases, women were undoubtedly sold against their will into horrific situations. However, the historical records show a more complex and surprising picture. In a great number of cases, the wife was a willing, and sometimes even enthusiastic, participant. Often, the auction was pure theater. The sale had been pre-arranged. The wife had already started a new relationship with another man, and the buyer was, in fact, her new partner. The entire ritual was a way to publicly legitimize this new union. The wife might even provide the money for her new partner to buy her. For a woman trapped in an abusive, loveless, or neglectful marriage, being sold was a ticket to freedom. It was her only way out. She could escape a miserable life and begin a new one with a man she actually chose. While the method was degrading, the outcome liberation was something she may have desperately wanted. This doesn't make the practice right, but it adds a crucial layer of nuance. The women weren't always passive victims, they were often active agents trying to navigate an oppressive system. The prices paid for wives varied dramatically and reveal a lot about the nature of the transaction. Some women were sold for substantial sums, up to £100 in one case, which was a fortune at the time. However, the vast majority of sales were for nominal amounts, a few shillings, a gallon of ale, or sometimes as little as a single penny. This shows that the price was rarely about the woman's worth. The monetary exchange was symbolic. Its purpose was to make the deal feel like a legitimate, binding contract. By paying something, however small, the buyer was formally taking on the responsibility for the woman, and the husband was formally relinquishing it. The most common prices were actually pints of beer or gin, with the deal being sealed as the three parties, husband, wife, and new partner, shared a drink at the pub. The low price underscored that this wasn't really a commercial transaction, it was a ritual of separation disguised as a sale. The Mayor of Casterbridge, From Fact to Fiction. This bizarre custom is perhaps most famously immortalized in Thomas Hardy's 1886 novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. The novel opens with the protagonist, Michael Henchard, getting drunk at a fair and auctioning off his wife, Susan, and their baby daughter to a sailor for 5 guineas. This single, impulsive act haunts him for the rest of his life. Hardy wasn't just inventing a shocking plot device. He was drawing directly from the historical record. He had read about actual cases of wife selling in local Dorset newspapers and was fascinated by the custom. Legal records from 1832 show a man named Joseph Thomson publicly sold his wife, Mary, in a similar fashion. He led her to a market in Carlisle with a halter and sold her for 1 shilling and a glass of ale. By putting this real-life folk custom at the center of his novel, Hardy exposed the shocking realities of rural life to a wider, wealthier Victorian audience who were largely ignorant of such practices. He showed how the desperate actions of the poor were judged and punished by a society that offered them no other choice. The slow death of a bizarre tradition. So why did this strange custom eventually die out? The decline was slow, but it was driven by profound social and legal changes. The most significant blow came in 1857 with the Matrimonial Causes Act. For the first time, divorce was moved from Parliament to a new, secular court. It was still far too expensive for the very poor, but it was a step towards accessibility for the middle classes. More importantly, the Victorian era saw the rise of a more powerful and centralized state. A new, professional police force began to enforce the law more rigorously across the country, cracking down on public disorders and unruly folk customs. The spread of railways and newspapers also began to erode the isolation of rural communities, breaking down the local traditions that had held sway for centuries. As society changed, wife selling came to be seen less as a tolerable local custom and more as a shameful, backward embarrassment. By the early 20th century, the practice had all but vanished, fading into a strange and unsettling footnote in English history. Outro music starts to fade back in. So, the horrific reason men sold their wives wasn't just a matter of simple cruelty or greed. It was a desperate, ritualized response to a society with a broken legal system. It was a world where the poor were trapped in their marriages, and the only escape route was a degrading public spectacle that treated a human being like property. It shines a harsh light on the vast gulf between the powerful and the poor in the Victorian era and reminds us that sometimes the most bizarre traditions are born from the deepest desperation. What a strange and disturbing piece of our history. What do you think? Was this a practical solution for its time, or an unforgivable act no matter the circumstances? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into hidden history fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories you were never taught in school. Sharing this video with a fellow history lover helps the channel more than you know. Thanks for watching.